All right, let's talk about high net worth divorce here for a minute. The basic elements of the divorce are exactly the same as any other divorce. High net worth divorce, the same concerns are going to be present as any other divorce, right? We've got property issues to figure out, and we got kid issues to figure out. That really is what there is in a divorce. But a high net worth divorce gets a lot more complicated many times because of the sheer size of the estate. The kid-related issues can be affected by the wealth of the parties, right? For example, imagine a typical divorce where you've got one or two kids, and one of them's in t-ball and one of them's in softball. And so there's some expenses that the parties go through, and we're trying to figure out a possession schedule where we're taking them to their games and all their practices. That's fairly typical. But in a high net worth divorce, you could have much more expensive hobbies. Imagine your kid is in equestrian events and they've got a $20,000 horse, and there's, thousands of dollars per month, just for boarding that horse and all the feed and all the training. We got a $50,000 trailer that we use to drive the horse all around the country, right? So there's some huge assets and huge expenses that go into this child's hobby, and these parents can afford it. Now that we're getting a divorce, now who's going to pay for all of that? How does that get paid for moving forward? So the high net worth divorce does have some kid-related issues potentially that we have to address just because of the sheer wealth of the parties. When we look at the property, though, that's where high net worth divorce gets really kind of sets itself apart from a typical divorce. The sheer number of accounts, the sheer number of assets. Many times a big divorce could involve a professional license. So imagine a surgeon, imagine a hotshot lawyer, imagine someone who owns numerous successful businesses. You've got big assets and typically lots of them, numerous accounts. Some of it may be separate property, some of it may be inherited, some of it may be community property or mixed character, where a particular asset is partially separate property and partially community. So there's lots of ways that high net worth divorces are more complex than a typical middle class type divorce. Many large asset divorces have people who are sophisticated enough to have sought legal advice before the divorce was necessary. So you've got strong business documents because one of the spouses is a business owner who sought significant legal advice and counsel in setting up the businesses. There could be LLCs that own other LLCs that own property that own other LLCs. It can get really complex. There could be prenups. There could be postnups. There could be prenups that have to get busted. There could be prenups that can't be busted, but there are assets that were not included in the prenup, right? So there are numerous ways that high net worth divorces can be more complex than a typical middle class, divorce. Another thing that drives up the cost and complexity of a high net worth divorce is often the financial accounting that has to go into it. With many high net worth divorces, one spouse is the primary owner and producer of all the income. The other spouse is typically longtime stay-at-home spouse. The longtime stay-at-home spouse frequently doesn't know anything about the actual financial records and the financial production of the money-generating assets in the marriage. So obviously, if you've got an executive who just brings home a big paycheck, that money is relatively easy to account for. But if you have a business owner that owns a business or two or three or four, and all their bookkeeping and all the accounts are managed by the business on the business side, the non-business owning spouse may not know anything about that. So there should be significant financial discovery to discover where all the accounts are and how much money is in all those accounts. There could be allegations of fraud. There could be allegations of mismanagement of that money, of breach of fiduciary duty by one spouse or the other. And now you could have significant forensic accounting of various accounts that leads to additional discovery and additional accounting. So it can get really complex depending on the allegations. Here is an interesting concept that most people don't really consider. In Texas, we call it goodwill. Imagine a surgeon, very high earning, business owning surgeon, owns his own practice. That surgeon's product is his intellectual property. It's his skill, it's his ideas that earn all the money. If he stopped being a surgeon, the business would die. It would not survive without him. And so the value of that business is him. Likewise, this firm that I'm in right now that I own with my wife, if something happened to me, this firm could continue because Holly would continue working in this firm. If something happened to both of us, this firm would have no value because the whole firm is our intellectual property. It's our ideas. It's our job to provide work for clients. But if Holly owned this business and I was a teacher or something like that, and we wanted a divorce, I can't separate the value of this business from Holly, right? Because she owned the entire business, she did all the work. So the value would lie with her. That part of the divorce, that part of the business can't be separated from her. So that is not an asset that can be divided. So when we start talking about high net worth people, we start looking at goodwill. What does the owner of the business, if there is a business to be owned, what does that owner contribute, and how much of that business relies 100% on the owner, right? So there's numerous aspects of a high net worth divorce that have to be considered. And if you're in a spot where there's millions of dollars, there's numerous businesses, there's numerous pieces of real estate, there's a bunch of cars, there's an airplane, there's timeshares, all the things, you for sure need a lawyer who understands how to break down and how to use external professionals to help break down the estate into bite-sized chunks, because sooner or later you're either going to reach an agreement that settles the divorce, or you're going to have to take it to trial. And these divorces can be more complex than the judge can really digest if you don't have it broken down into small pieces. So finding the right lawyer to work your high net worth divorce, that's going to be a key. In a high net worth divorce scenario, community property laws still exist in Texas, right? So they still apply. And so when we start dividing up a marital estate, sometimes if you think of the marital estate in terms of, everything puts in as a pie, sometimes you only have a pie this big. Sometimes you got a really big pie. But the rules for slicing the pie and dividing it between the spouses are the same. So the rules that apply to a small estate are the same rules that apply to a big estate. Where we really run into the problems is identifying all the assets that make up the big estate. The larger the estate, the greater the likelihood of numerous assets, lots of properties, lots of businesses, lots of financial accounts, so lots of bank accounts, lots of brokerage accounts, lots of retirement accounts, these other stocks over here, this crypto over there, these investments, these things that have numismatic value. There's lots of assets that could be divided. And then, when it comes to dividing assets, as lawyers, we don't have to divide each asset. We divide the estate. And so whenever possible, we like to put whole assets into one spouse's column or the other. So we don't have to divide each and every business. We don't have to divide each piece of real estate. If the spouses have 5 rent properties, maybe 4 of them go in one column and only 1 of them goes in the other, because there's other assets to go in that column, and so we can kind of even things out. And of course, ultimately, there could be a buyout or payments to the other spouse long after the divorce is over to help equalize the marital estate. Okay, so sometimes we start dividing the assets in a way that the only way that makes sense, and one spouse needs to still get paid to make sure that we have a nice even split of the estate, or at least a split that's agreeable between the parties. Child support in a high net worth divorce works the same as as any other child support case, with a couple of exceptions. So the best interest of the child factors in, right? The family judges are required to consider the best interest of the child. In a high net worth divorce, a lot of times the children are involved in some more expensive, unusually expensive sports or events, or they have unusually or uncommonly expensive hobbies. And very often what we see is that the courts don't think it's the best interest of the child to deprive the child of those hobbies just because the parents are getting a divorce. It could be possible that above child support, the court could order that the one or both spouses continue to pay for this child's events. So again, imagine the horse activities, the equestrian events. You've got a child who for years has been riding an expensive horse. You got having to board the horse, all the feed, all the vet bills, the trailer, the fuel, carting a horse all around the country. That's super expensive, and most middle class folks don't have that kind of expense for their child. Well, child support is not going to pay for all of that. And so it's possible that the non-custodial parent could be ordered to pay child support and additionally to pay for that event. So if you have an expensive child because you have run a big spending household and you've got a large estate, it could be possible that the court could order you to continue paying for that child's event over and above your child support. Now, as to child support, there is some relief because the family code only goes so high on your income. Once you make about $12,500 a month, I think it's actually $12,250. Once you get to that, you've kind of maxed out child support, right? The courts typically won't order you to pay more child support above that guideline. If you're $1 million, $2 million, $3 million a year earner, your child support is still probably maxed out there at that $9,200 net income, about $1,840 for one child. So child support for you, if you are a very high earner, is actually a smaller percentage of your income than people who earn much less than you. So, on the one hand, there's some benefits in the family code on the child support amount guidelines, but on the other hand, if your child is in an expensive sport or has an expensive hobby and the child has been doing it for a long time, the court could order that you would continue to make those payments to keep that child in that event, in addition to the child support you're also ordered to pay. So what about alimony in a high net worth divorce? Texas is not an alimony state, so we don't have alimony here. We do have spousal maintenance, post-divorce spousal maintenance. Now, the analysis for post-divorce spousal maintenance is pretty stringent. The family code doesn't like spousal maintenance. The expectation is once the parties are divorced, they should separate their business from each other as much as they can. Yes, we have to continue to deal with each other for the benefit of the kid. Ideally, we have a nice, friendly co-parenting relationship that helps us raise this kid. Even though we're not spouses, we're still parents. The courts don't like for the parties to get divorced and then one spouse has still got their hand out to the other to help support their life, right? There's an analysis of how spousal maintenance will be calculated. They do an analysis of whether a spouse even qualifies for spousal maintenance. And of course, if there's a prenup or some kind of a postnup that contemplates contractual alimony or contractual spousal maintenance after the divorce, then that would come into play. Yes, you could agree to spousal maintenance as part of your prenup or your postnup, but the courts still are going to do that analysis that's in the family code. Although I tend to believe that If a spouse has been a high net worth stay-at-home spouse, they've got a very high standard of living, an unusually high standard of living for this area. They get divorced. I hypothesize that the courts are going to want to help stabilize them because they're going to go from a very high standard of living. If they've been a stay-at-home spouse to a very high net worth income, they're going to go way, way down in their standard of living. And I believe that many courts will see that as unequitable. And so, depending on what assets they get from the divorce, depending on what any cash payouts or any assets like retirement accounts or cash money or real estate properties, if they get plenty of that, they might not get spousal maintenance. If they don't get a lot of that stuff, the court may order some spousal maintenance to give them time to get up and get on their feet. I speculate that the rules may be a little bit more lax if the court knows that one spouse is just really wealthy and are going to continue to be wealthy, and the other spouse is fixing to go from a wealthy status to a broke status. So I believe just from an equitable standpoint, the court would probably want to give a little leeway on the spousal maintenance. So, we would consider that in our settlement negotiations to see what we could do to make sure that that spouse doesn't want to take it all the way to trial in order to avoid being destitute. So if you're facing a divorce and you're a high income household, you're a high income individual, you need a lawyer that knows how to deal with that. All right. So there's a lot of folks out there who do divorces. Any lawyer can get you a divorce decree, but some folks have the competence and the understanding on how to get that right. Okay. So I would invite you to give us a call, do your free, case evaluation, and see if we're a good fit for you. But certainly, if you're a high net worth individual or you come from a high net worth household, finding the right lawyer to help you with your divorce is going to make a huge difference during the divorce and long after the divorce is over. So you really only get one chance to get it right. And I would invite you to give us a call and see if we're the ones to help you do that.